when you asked for a deep dive on this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I knew right away this was going to be, well, pretty challenging.
Right.
It's such a complicated story.
Mm.
And I think it's not just about the history.
Right.
Right? I mean, it's about understanding how come peace has been so hard to find for so long.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're not going to just focus on, dates and battles and stuff.
Right.
It's about looking deeper at what's really driving this conflict, like those underlying issues.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, our source uses this really powerful analogy, right?
Yeah.
Talk about how some conflicts, it's almost like they're sick. They say sick with geopolitics.
Oh, right.
Which I thought was such an interesting way to put it. And they even go so far as to call Gaza, the situation in Gaza, like a geopolitical coma.
Wow.
So what do you think they mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty stark way to say it, but it really highlights how where a place is, its geography can be sometimes it's a blessing, but a lot of times it's like a curse.
It can determine your fate almost.
Exactly. And, think about some other places in the world.
Okay.
Like Poland.
Oh, yeah.
Or even Korea.
Right.
Countries that are kind of stuck in between these big, powerful neighbors.
Yeah, right.
Their location makes them targets, even if they don't want to be involved in a conflict.
So it's like they almost can't escape it because of where they are.
Yeah, it's almost like geography is destiny for those places.
Wow.
And that's kind of what we see in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict too, but on a whole other level.
Okay, so bring that back to this conflict. How does geography play such a key role?
Well, imagine this.
Okay.
You have this small piece of land,
Mm-hmm.
a region that's incredibly important to different groups of people, right? Like really deeply important religiously, historically.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you layer in colonialism, broken promises from powerful countries, and this really deep desire for both sides to have their own independent nation.
So it's not just about the land itself. It's all this baggage.
Exactly. It's a recipe for, well, you can imagine it's explosive.
Yeah, no, it's a powder keg. So to understand that, we got to go back, right? Rewind the clock.
Yeah.
How far back are we talking?
Our deep dive, it takes us back to the early 1900s. Think about it. It's the beginning of the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled this whole region for centuries, is falling apart. The world's changing fast.
It's on the brink.
Totally. And amidst all this change, you've got both the Jewish and Arab populations in Palestine. They're looking for a place to call their own. They want independence.
Yeah, self-determination.
Yeah.
Right, like everyone wants that.
Absolutely. But this is where things get messy.
Okay, here we go.
Great Britain, they're the big global superpower at the time.
Right.
And they start making promises to both the Jews and the Arabs about Palestine.
Oh, boy. I see where this is going. Promising the same land to two different groups.
Yeah.
That can't end well, can it?
Well, yeah, you're already seeing the problem, right?
Right.
This idea that someone else can come in and just promise your land away. It's a huge betrayal. And honestly, that sense of betrayal, it's at the core of so much of the conflict we see even today. It's a wound that never really healed.
Yeah, and it just keeps getting ripped open.
Exactly.
So when we talk about these promises, we have to talk about the Balfour Declaration. I mean, that's a big one, right? 1917?
1917, yep. Picture this. World War I is raging on.
The world is in chaos.
Total chaos. And right in the middle of it, Britain makes this declaration promising a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people.
Hold on. I thought you said Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire then.
Exactly. They're making promises about land they don't even control.
It's like selling something you don't even own.
It's exactly like that. And to make matters worse, this declaration, it basically ignores the Arabs who are already living in Palestine.
Completely dismisses them.
Yeah, like they don't even exist.
No. So it sounds like Britain's trying to play both sides.
Totally.
Trying to make everyone happy and not thinking about the future consequences.
And oh boy, were there consequences.
Right.
You can argue that the Balfour Declaration, maybe some people had good intentions, but you can't argue that it made an already tense situation a million times worse.
Poured gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. It created resentment on the Arab side. It raised expectations on the Jewish side. And it set the stage for the conflict that we're still trying to unpack today.
It's like this one document just sent shockwaves through history.
Yeah, it's no exaggeration to say that.
Wow.
And, it's important to remember the UN partition plan, it might have seemed like a way to move forward, like a logical solution. But a lot of people in the Arab world, they saw it as a total betrayal.
Yeah, I could see that.
It was like outsiders coming in and just carving up land that they considered theirs.
Dividing it up without really understanding.
Exactly. And that feeling, that sense of being ignored and disregarded, it fueled a lot of anger and resentment.
So instead of two states emerging peacefully, like the UN hoped,
Right.
we see the eruption of the first Arab-Israeli war.
Exactly, 1948. And that's where we see this other tragedy unfold, a tragedy that still has a huge impact on the region today, the Palestinian exodus.
Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes.
Hundreds of thousands, forced to flee, seeking refuge in neighboring countries.
It's hard to even imagine that scale of displacement. It's been decades, and the consequences are still felt today.
It's true. The Palestinian refugee crisis, it's a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict. It's not just about land, or political control. It's about families, generations of families who have experienced trauma and loss.
Right. Real people caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. Their lives were completely upended by forces outside of their control.
And the sad thing is, the conflict doesn't end there.
No, not at all.
Our sources go on to talk about all the wars that followed.
Yeah.
The Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War in '67, the Yom Kippur War. It just feels like this relentless cycle, violence and retaliation back and forth.
It's true. And it's crucial to understand how each one of these wars, they just deepen the existing wounds, make the mistrust even worse between the two sides.
Right. Every conflict adds another layer of pain.
Exactly. Like take the Six-Day War, for example. Our sources really highlight that one as a major turning point. That's when Israel takes control of Gaza, the Golan Heights, the West Bank.
Those territories are always in the news. They're often referred to as occupied territories. Why is their capture so significant?
Well, for one thing, it drastically changes the map, right? Suddenly, Israel's in control of these areas that were predominantly Palestinian.
Right.
And this is also when you start to see Israeli settlements being built in those territories.
Which, if I remember correctly, becomes a major sticking point in all the peace talks later on.
Exactly. It's like this huge knot, this tangle of competing claims and territorial disputes, and it just gets tighter and tighter.
A Gordian knot of geopolitics, you could say.
That's a good way to put it. And then right at the heart of it all, you have Jerusalem.
Ah, Jerusalem.
Captured by Israel during the Six-Day War, right?
That's right. And this is where things get really complicated.
Because
Jerusalem isn't just any city. It holds immense religious significance for Jews, Muslims, Christians. All three major religions consider it holy.
So you have these overlapping claims to history, identity, belonging, all concentrated in one place.
Exactly. It's like our source says, the insoluble problem.
And it's not just the religious aspect, right? Didn't Israel declare Jerusalem as its unified capital in '67?
They did, yeah. But that move, it's largely unrecognized by the rest of the world.
It's like a microcosm of the larger conflict, isn't it? This one city.
Exactly. All those tensions, all those competing narratives, they all converge in Jerusalem. It's almost overwhelming to think about. So we have these wars, these deepening divisions, and then our source points to these, well, glimmers of hope.
Yeah, you're right. Even in the midst of all this darkness, you do see these moments where people try to find another way.
Like flickers of light.
Yeah, exactly. And the late 20th century actually saw some pretty remarkable attempts to break the cycle of violence.
To actually try to find peace.
Exactly. And even though they weren't ultimately successful, I think we can still learn a lot from them. They show us just how complex this conflict really is.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there are no easy answers.
Right. So let's talk about some of those attempts. You've got the Camp David Accords in 1978.
Okay, Camp David. That's when Egypt, a major Arab power, officially recognizes Israel.
Right, for the first time ever.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, to have an Arab nation actually sign a peace treaty with Israel.
It was a watershed moment, no doubt about it. Brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, the Accords, they painted this vision of peaceful coexistence, this idea of land for peace.
So there was this feeling that maybe, just maybe, things are starting to change.
There was, definitely. But it didn't come without a price. While a lot of people saw the Accords as a beacon of hope, like a sign that peace was possible,
Right.
they also faced some really fierce opposition.
I bet, from people who just couldn't accept any kind of compromise, any kind of peace.
Exactly. Especially extremist groups. They saw it as a betrayal.
Of course. And sadly, that opposition turned deadly.
Yeah, it did. Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, he was a key figure in making the peace treaty happen. He was assassinated in 1981 by Islamic extremists.
That's awful. And it just goes to show how deeply entrenched the resistance to peace can be. It's like this vicious cycle that's so hard to break.
It really is. But the pursuit of a solution, it didn't end there.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, we see the Oslo Accords.
Oslo. Another attempt, another moment of hope.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Oslo was remarkable in a lot of ways. I mean, for the first time, you had Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO.
Which, just to clarify for our listeners, that's the PLO is recognized internationally as the representatives of the Palestinian people, right?
That's right. So you have Israel and the PLO for the very first time officially acknowledging each other.
So for the first time, you have these two entities, Israel and the PLO, saying, we see each other, we recognize each other's right to exist. That feels huge.
It really was. I mean, it was a major turning point. And it led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
Right.
They were given control over parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
Okay.
And for a while, I think a lot of people felt like a two-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. It actually seemed within reach.
Like, it felt tangible.
It did.
There's always a but, right.
There is. Sadly, the road to peace, it's rarely a straight line.
Yeah, more like a roller coaster, it seems like.
Exactly. And the Oslo Accords, I mean, they were groundbreaking, but they faced intense opposition.
From both sides.
Oh, yeah. Some Israelis, they saw it as a betrayal. Giving up land, even for peace, it was just too much for them. And some Palestinians, they felt like it wasn't enough, like they were still being shortchanged. True self-determination felt far off for them.
So even this agreement that was supposed to bring everyone closer, it also pushed them further apart.
In a way, yeah. And then you have the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister.
Right, 1995.
Wow.
Our sources talk about how devastating that was for the peace process.
He was a key figure in Oslo, he really pushed for it. And then to have him killed by a Jewish extremist who opposed the peace process, it was a huge blow.
Like, how do you even come back from something like that?
Yeah, it's tough. And honestly, I think it really shook people's faith in the possibility of peace, If the leader who's championing these agreements can be killed because of them, what hope is there?
It's such a tragedy. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, the violence escalates even further in the 21st century.
Right. You have the rise of Hamas in Gaza.
Hamas. Give us some background on them.
So Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by Israel, the U.S., and several other countries.
Okay.
And they control Gaza, but crucially, they totally reject Israel's right to exist. In fact, they call for its disruption.
So that just throws another wrench into the whole thing.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex conflict.
Right. And speaking of complex, our sources talk about this shift in the peace process from a land for peace model to what they call a peace for security approach.
Yeah, that's a key distinction.
Help us understand that shift. What does it mean practically?
So early on, the focus was all about land, right? Israel gives up control of certain territories, and in exchange, they get peace agreements. That was the basic idea.
Makes sense.
But over time, as more and more Israeli settlements are built in the West Bank, that kind of land swap becomes almost impossible.
Right. Too many people are already living there.
Exactly. So you see this shift where it becomes less about finding a long-term solution to the land issue and more about just managing the conflict, keeping things from boiling over.
So it's more about containing the violence than achieving actual peace.
In a way, yes. Israel's security becomes the top priority, often at the expense of Palestinian autonomy, their hopes for their own state.
And that just leads to more resentment, more anger, more violence.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle. You have attacks, followed by crackdowns, and with every cycle, it just deepens the mistrust. It makes it harder and harder to even have a real dialogue,
It's like this downward spiral.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get caught up in the politics, the arguments over borders and settlements, but at the end of the day, this is about real people.
Exactly. It's about human beings.
Our source, they really capture this in a powerful way. They talk about the Palestinian perspective, how they feel like they've been forgotten, pushed aside. And they use this phrase, they say, they promised us a land too.
That's such a powerful statement. It speaks volumes. It gets to the heart of this feeling of loss, this yearning for a place to belong, this sense that promises were made and broken.
And that feeling, that sense of injustice, it just festers. So where do we go from here? I mean, after everything we've discussed, after all this history, all this pain, Is there any hope for a different future?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, it's easy to feel despair, to feel like this cycle will just keep repeating itself. But our source, they actually end on a surprisingly hopeful note.
Truly.
They point to these other conflicts that seemed just as intractable, just as impossible to resolve. The conflict in Ireland, for example, they were fighting for, what, 800 years?
It's hard to even fathom that length of time.
I know. And Rwanda, the genocide there, horrific. But even in those places, after all that hatred and violence, they found a way to start rebuilding, to find some measure of peace.
So they're saying if it's possible there, maybe, just maybe, it's possible here too.
Exactly. But it takes a shift, a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
A willingness to imagine a different future.
How do we even begin to make that shift? Where do we start?
Well, our source highlights the role of women, and specifically mothers.
Mothers.
Yeah, mothers who have lost children in this conflict on both sides. They've been instrumental in peace movements around the world.
Because who understands the cost of conflict better than a mother who's lost a child?
Exactly. They bring this different perspective. It's rooted in empathy, in understanding, and often, their voices are marginalized in those formal peace processes.
So it's about amplifying those voices, the voices that are often overlooked.
Exactly. It's about listening to those who understand the human cost of this conflict more than anyone. And it's about challenging those narratives, those stories we tell ourselves that keep us divided.
Because if we keep telling the same stories, the same narratives of grievance and victimhood,
Right.
then nothing's ever going to change.
Exactly. We need a new story, one that leaves room for empathy, for understanding, for forgiveness.
That's a tall order for sure.
It is. But I think that's the challenge our source is leaving us with. Because as they so powerfully ask, how many more generations will inherit this pain? It's a question we all need to sit with.
It really is. And on that note, that's our deep dive for today.
Yeah.
A huge thank you to our expert for even attempting to unpack this incredibly complex and challenging topic.
It's been my pleasure, really.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We know this is heavy stuff, but it's important. Keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for those glimmers of hope, even in the darkest of places.